I never wanted the house. When my Uncle Richard's lawyer contacted me about inheriting the sprawling estate in rural Vermont, my first instinct was to sell it immediately. But something about the way he described the property, the way his voice trembled slightly when he mentioned its history, made me hesitate. The house was called Shadowmere. Even the name sent a chill down my spine. My name is Daniel Hartley, and I'm a 35-year-old freelance journalist who's seen his fair share of strange assignments. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me in that secluded mansion, nestled deep in the misty forests of northern Vermont. I arrived late in the afternoon, the GPS signal fading in and out as I navigated the winding mountain roads. The rental SUV's tires crunched against gravel as I finally pulled up to the property. Massive oak trees surrounded the house, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers, casting long shadows across the weathered Victorian structure. Shadowmere was massive, a 3-story monstrosity of gray stone and dark wood, with turrets that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Moss crawled up its walls, and several windows were boarded up, giving the impression that the house was slowly being consumed by the wilderness around it. My Uncle Richard had been a reclusive historian, specializing in obscure New England folklore. I'd only met him a handful of times during my childhood, and those memories were fuzzy at best. A tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes and a perpetual look of concentration. He'd always seemed more interested in his research than in connecting with family. The lawyer had mentioned that Uncle Richard had died under unusual circumstances, but refused to elaborate over the phone. Now, standing before the house, I understood why. The front door was secured with an old brass lock that took me several minutes to open. The key was an antique, heavy and intricate, with strange symbols etched into its surface. When I finally managed to turn it, the door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire structure. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through the boarded windows. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a house that had been uninhabited for months. Layers of dust covering ornate furniture, cobwebs stretching between elaborate picture frames, and a musty smell that spoke of decades of accumulated secrets. Little did I know that the house was about to reveal those secrets, and that my life would never be the same again. The first room that caught my attention was the study. Unlike the rest of the house, it seemed meticulously maintained. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked both ancient and pristine. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in stacks of papers, journals, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. I approached the desk, my curiosity overwhelming my growing sense of unease. Uncle Richard's research materials were everywhere, scattered notes, newspaper clippings, photographs that looked like they dated back to the early 1900s. One journal, bound in dark green leather, lay open. The handwriting was precise, almost surgical in its neatness. As I leaned closer, I realized it was a detailed account of something called the Shadowmere incident, a term that appeared repeatedly throughout the pages. My journalistic instincts kicked in. Whatever this was, it was more than just another family mystery. There was something deeper here, something that had consumed my uncle's entire life. Little did I know that by reading those pages, I was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality, history, and the thin veil between our world and something else. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive with a different kind of energy. The wind outside created low, mournful sounds that seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls. I continued studying my uncle's research, my laptop providing the only modern light in the room full of antique furnishings. The journal entries became increasingly bizarre. Uncle Richard had been investigating something he called the Blackwood Convergence, a series of unexplained disappearances that had occurred in this region dating back to the late 1800s. His notes suggested a pattern that went far beyond typical missing person cases. One particular entry caught my eye. June 17th, the connections are clearer now. The land remembers. The land knows. The disappearances are not random, they're ritualistic. Something beneath Shadowmere wants to be remembered. A sudden creaking sound from upstairs made me jump. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but the hairs on the back of my neck told a different story. I hadn't intended to explore the basement that night, but a strange sound, something between a whisper and a scrape, drew me toward the narrow door I'd initially overlooked. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each step feeling like a betrayal of the house's ancient silence. The basement was larger than I expected. Unlike the meticulously organized study, this space looked like a museum of madness. Glass jars lined shelves, containing what looked like preserved specimens. Some were clearly animal remains, others, I wasn't so sure. Maps covered one entire wall, with intricate red strings connecting various locations, creating a web of mysterious connections. In the far corner, something gleamed. A metal lockbox, surprisingly clean compared to the dust-covered surroundings. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened it. Inside, I found photographs, old, sepia-toned images that seemed to date back to the late 19th century. They showed a group of people standing in front of Shadowmere, but something was wrong. Their faces, they weren't quite human, distorted, elongated, as if something was wearing human skin, but didn't quite understand how to make it look right. One photograph was different. A young woman, her eyes looking directly at the camera with an intensity that made my blood run cold. On the back, in my uncle's precise handwriting, Elizabeth Blackwood, 1887, the first witness. The knock at the front door came just after midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't told anyone I was here. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity, that dangerous journalist's trait, got the better of me. When I opened the door, no one was there, just darkness and the sound of wind moving through the trees. But something had been left on the doorstep, a leather-bound journal. My uncle's journal, I realized, but not the one I'd been reading in the study. This one was different, newer. And when I opened it, I saw my own name written on the first page. Daniel, it read, if you're reading this, you've already started something that cannot be stopped. They know you're here now. The temperature in the hallway dropped suddenly, and from somewhere deep within the house, I heard something that might have been a laugh or a scream. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The journal I'd found sat on the desk, its pages seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy. Every time I tried to focus on the text, the words would blur, then realign in ways that didn't make sense. Around 3 a.m., the witching hour, as some would say, the house began to speak to me. Not in words, exactly. More like impressions, fragments of memory that weren't my own. I saw flashes of a woman in a white dress, her face pale as moonlight. I saw children, or what I thought were children, moving in ways children shouldn't move. The photographs from the basement seemed to watch me. In the dim light of my laptop, I could have sworn the figures in those sepia images were shifting, their mouths opening in silent screams. I opened my uncle's journal again. This time, the words came into focus. They are not ghosts. They are not spirits. They are something else entirely. A memory that bleeds. A history that refuses to die. By morning, I discovered more about Elizabeth Blackwood. She wasn't just a name in a photograph. She was the key to everything. According to my uncle's meticulously kept records, Elizabeth was the daughter of one of the original settlers in this region. But she was different. The local records suggested she had been both feared and revered. Accounts from the time spoke of her ability to see beyond the veil, to understand things that ordinary people couldn't comprehend. One particularly disturbing entry caught my attention. Elizabeth knew. She always knew. The land was hungry. The land remembered every drop of blood, every broken promise, and it would have its reckoning. A loud thump from the attic interrupted my reading. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, wooden structures settle, but this was different. This was deliberate. I found the attic door hidden behind a large bookcase in the hallway. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to conceal its existence. The stairs leading up were narrow, each step creaking with decades of accumulated weight. The attic was nothing like the rest of the house. While everything below was meticulously organized, this space was chaos. Broken dolls with missing eyes, torn photographs, fragments of maps, and in the center, a large trunk that looked like it had been waiting for me. The lock was unusual, not like any modern mechanism. It seemed to be made of intertwined metal, almost like roots or veins. When I touched it, I felt a surge of something. Memory? Pain? It was impossible to distinguish. The trunk opened with a sound like a long-held breath being released. Inside, I found something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, about this house, about reality itself. A collection of bones. Not human bones, not animal bones, something in between. And a letter, addressed to me, in my uncle's handwriting. Daniel, it read, "You were never supposed to come here, but now that you have, there's no turning back." The bones in the trunk were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Pale, almost translucent, they seemed to shimmer with an inner light that defied natural explanation. Some were clearly human in origin, but others, twisted, elongated, with joints that bent at impossible angles. A folded document lay beneath the bones. As I unfolded it, I realized it was a genealogy chart, my family's history stretching back to the early settlers of Vermont. But this was no ordinary family tree. Red lines connected certain names, creating a complex web that seemed more like a ritual diagram than a simple family record. My name was at the bottom of the chart, circled in what looked like dried blood. The silence of the attic was suddenly suffocating. I could hear something, a rhythmic sound that might have been breathing, or might have been something else entirely. A low, pulsing vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My phone rang, shattering the silence. It was Sarah, my ex-girlfriend and the only other person who might care enough to check on me. "Danny?" Her voice sounded different, distant. "Have you found it yet?" I froze. "Found what?" A laugh that wasn't quite human escaped her lips. "The thing you were always meant to find, the reason you're the last one." Before I could respond, the call disconnected, but something remained, a lingering sense that the conversation ever truly happened, or perhaps it had happened years ago, or was yet to happen. The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls pulsing with a life of their own. I discovered the hidden room quite by accident, a loose panel in the study's wall, barely visible behind a massive bookshelf. When I pressed against it, the wood gave way with a sound like a long-held secret finally being released. The room was small, windowless. Every surface was covered in drawings, maps, diagrams, human figures that weren't quite human, complex mathematical equations intertwined with what looked like arcane symbols. My uncle's work, clearly, but something more than just research. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, but it wasn't reflecting the room behind me. Instead, it showed a landscape that couldn't exist, a twilight world of twisted trees and impossible geometries. Creatures moved in the background, shapes that defied description, that existed between movement and stillness, and they were looking back at me. One of the creatures, if you could call it that, raised what might have been a hand, a gesture of recognition, of invitation, of inevitable convergence. Something fundamental had changed. The house was no longer just a structure. It was alive, breathing, watching. I could feel the memories seeping through the walls. Not my memories, not my uncle's memories. Something older, something that predated human understanding. The mirror in the hidden room continued to pulse with that impossible landscape. Creatures moved just beyond the edge of perception, their forms shifting between solid and shadow. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that they were waiting, watching, preparing. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "The lineage remembers. You cannot escape what you are." When I looked up, the mirror had changed, no longer showing that twilight landscape. It now reflected my own face. But something was wrong. The reflection moved a split second after I did, and its eyes, those were not my eyes. I found my grandmother's journal hidden in a false bottom of an old trunk. The pages were yellow with age, the ink faded but still legible. Her handwriting was precise, almost clinical, much like my uncle's. June 15, 1954. "They will come for him, the child born with the mark, the one who bridges worlds." Margin notes were filled with strange symbols, mathematical equations that seemed to fold in on themselves. Diagrams of human anatomy mixed with something else, something that existed between biological classification and pure nightmare. A photograph fell from between the pages. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of Shadowmere. His eyes were wrong, not in color or shape, but in something deeper, a knowledge that no child should possess. I realized with growing horror that the boy in the photograph was me. The basement called to me, not with sound exactly, but with a presence that vibrated just beyond human perception. Those glass jars I'd seen before, they were no longer just containing specimens. They were moving, pulsing, alive. One jar in particular caught my attention. Unlike the others, it was made of a material that didn't look like glass, something older, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside, something moved. A hand pressed against the inside of the jar. Human-like, but not quite human. Too long, fingers that bent at impossible angles, pale as moonlight, with something that might have been veins or intricate tattoos running beneath the skin. And then it spoke. Not with sound, but directly into my mind. "We've been waiting for you, Daniel." The voice in my mind was neither male nor female. It was something else entirely, a sound that existed between thought and language, between memory and nightmare. "You are the last," it said. "The final vessel." I tried to speak, but found my mouth wouldn't work. The basement seemed to expand and contract, the walls breathing with an organic rhythm that defied architectural logic. Those glass jars, no, they weren't just jars, they were containers. Prisons, each one holding something that existed between life and something else. The hand pressed against the strange jar continued to move. Not just a hand, I realized. A map, a living diagram of something incomprehensible. My Uncle Richard's research began to make sense. But understanding was worse than ignorance. The Blackwood family, my family, had been more than just settlers. They were guardians, watchers, people who understood that the boundary between our world and something else was far more permeable than anyone could imagine. Elizabeth Blackwood wasn't just a woman from the 1800s. She was a key, a living threshold between realities. I found more photographs. Each one revealed something more terrifying than the last. People whose bodies seemed to blur at the edges, landscapes that couldn't exist, mathematical equations that looked like they were written in a language that predated human understanding. One photograph showed a ritual, a gathering of people in white robes, standing in a perfect geometric pattern. At the center, a structure that was neither building nor living thing. Something that pulsed with an inner light. Handwritten notes in the margin, "The convergence approaches. The vessel must be prepared." Pain began in my left hand. Not a normal pain, something deeper, something cellular. I watched in horror as my skin began to change, not like a normal transformation, more like a revelation. Intricate patterns emerged, not tattoos, but something living, moving, breathing. The symbols from the photographs, the equations from my uncle's research, they were writing themselves into my skin. My phone rang. Sarah again. "It's time," she said. Her voice was different now, multiple voices, overlapping. "You cannot resist what you are." The house around me began to shift, walls moving, rooms expanding. Shadowmere was no longer just a building. It was becoming something else, something alive, something waiting. The transformation wasn't painful anymore. It was something else entirely, a revelation. My skin continued to shift, those intricate symbols moving like living mathematics, creating patterns that seemed to breathe with their own consciousness. I understood now why my uncle had isolated himself, why generations of my family had kept Shadowmere a secret. This wasn't just a house, it was a nexus, a point where realities converged. The basement walls began to ripple, not like normal walls. These were alive, membranes that separated worlds, growing thin and translucent. Through them, I could see glimpses of something else. Landscapes that defied natural geometry, creatures that existed between shadow and form. Fragments of memory flooded my mind. Not my memories, generations of memories. Elizabeth Blackwood, standing on a hillside in 1887, her hands raised to a sky that wasn't quite right. My grandmother performing a ritual in the 1950s, protecting something that shouldn't exist. My Uncle Richard, spending decades documenting something most humans were never meant to understand. A voice whispered, multiple voices, overlapping, "You are the bridge, the point of convergence." The symbols on my skin began to glow. Not with light exactly, with something deeper, a knowledge that predated human perception. They started to arrive just after midnight. Not people, not exactly. Figures that moved between human and something else. Some looked like they had stepped out of those old sepia photographs. Others appeared more modern, their forms shimmering at the edges. Sarah was among them, but not the Sarah I remembered. This version moved with a precision that wasn't human. Her eyes reflected something ancient, something waiting. "The vessel is ready," she said, but the words came from everywhere, inside my mind, from the walls, from the very air itself. Shadowmere was no longer just a house, it was becoming a living threshold, and I was the key. The figures surrounding me were no longer trying to appear human. Tendrils of darkness moved around their forms, shifting between solid and spectral. Some looked like they were constructed from fragments of memory, others from something more primordial. Sarah stepped forward, if you could call it stepping. Her movement was more like a thought becoming flesh. "You are the final piece," she said. But the voice wasn't just hers. It was a chorus, generations of voices speaking simultaneously. The symbols on my skin continued to pulse, each one a living equation, a mathematical representation of something beyond human comprehension. I could feel the knowledge burning into me. Not just memories, not just history, a complete understanding of what Shadowmere truly was. The basement transformed. No longer a confined space, it became something else. A vast chamber that defied spatial logic. Geometric patterns emerged on the floor, complex diagrams that seemed to breathe, to move, to calculate. The glass jars from earlier were arranged in a perfect circle, but they were no longer just containers. They were nodes, connection points between realities. My Uncle Richard's research suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't been studying something. He had been preparing something, preparing me. I understood now why my family had guarded this secret for generations. Shadowmere wasn't just a house, it was a nexus, a point where multiple realities intersected. And I was the bridge. The figures around me, neither fully human nor completely other, began to chant, not with sound, with something deeper, a vibration that resonated through molecular structures, through time itself. The walls of Shadowmere began to dissolve, not physically, but in perception. I could see multiple versions of the house simultaneously, versions from different times, different realities, all converging on this moment, on me. Reality fractured. One moment I was standing in the basement of Shadowmere, surrounded by those impossible beings. The next, I was everywhere and nowhere, witnessing multiple versions of myself, of the house, of moments that had happened and moments that would happen. I saw my Uncle Richard performing a ritual decades ago, saw my grandmother protecting something precious, saw Elizabeth Blackwood standing on a windswept hill in 1887, her hands raised to a sky that bent and twisted like living fabric. The symbols on my skin were no longer just markings. They were a language, a living calculation that described the very fabric of existence. Sarah, or what had been Sarah, approached me. Her form shifted constantly, revealing layers of existence that human perception couldn't comprehend. "You are the vessel," she said, but the words were a vibration, a mathematical equation, a promise. I understood now. The Blackwood family wasn't just a family. We were guardians, watchers, those who maintained the boundary between realities. Each generation selected one who could bear the weight of understanding. And I was the last. The glass jars in the basement began to resonate, not with sound, with something deeper, a frequency that existed between thought and matter. Shadowmere was becoming something else. Not just a house, not just a location, but a living threshold. I could see multiple versions of the house simultaneously. A Victorian mansion, a modern structure, something that existed before architecture, something that would exist long after human civilization had crumbled. The figures around me were no longer trying to appear human. Tendrils of darkness moved around their forms, shifting between solid and spectral. Some looked constructed from fragments of memory, others from something more primordial. A voice, multiple voices, spoke directly into my consciousness. "The vessel is ready. The convergence begins." The moment of convergence arrived with a silence more profound than any sound I'd ever experienced. Shadowmere's walls began to dissolve, not in a physical sense, but in perception. I could see through them, through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Rooms existed in impossible configurations, spaces folded and unfolded like living origami. The beings around me were no longer distinct entities. They merged and separated, becoming a collective consciousness that pulsed with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. Sarah, or what remained of her, was now just a fragment of something much larger. "You are the key," they said. The final connection. Memories flooded my consciousness. Not just my own, but generations of memories. I saw my ancestors, the Blackwood lineage, standing at similar thresholds. Each generation had been prepared for this moment, each one a guardian, a keeper of a secret that would destroy the human understanding of reality. Elizabeth Blackwood's memories were the strongest. I saw her standing on a hill in 1887, witnessing something that came from beyond the boundaries of our world, a tear in reality, a moment when something ancient and incomprehensible began to seep through. The symbols on my skin were no longer just markings. They were a living language, a code that described the fundamental mechanics of existence. The basement, no, the entire house, became a living calculation. Geometric patterns emerged on every surface, moving and shifting like living mathematics. The glass jars began to resonate, each one a node in a complex network that stretched beyond human perception. I understood now why my family had guarded this secret for generations. Shadowmere was more than a house. It was a nexus, a point where multiple realities intersected. And I was the bridge. The voices, a chorus of generations, continued. The vessel is prepared. The convergence begins. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Something fundamental was breaking. Not just the walls of Shadowmere, not just the barriers of perception, something deeper. The very membrane that separated realities was tearing apart, and I was at the center of it all. My body was no longer entirely my own. The symbols that had been etched into my skin were now moving, shifting, becoming something more than markings. They were a living language, a code that described the fundamental mechanics of existence. The beings around me, those impossible entities that had once resembled humans, were now pure energy, consciousness without form. They moved through the space between moments, between thoughts. "The vessel is ready," they said. "The convergence begins." I saw everything simultaneously. My grandmother's ritual in 1954, my uncle's research, Elizabeth Blackwood's discovery in 1887. Each moment a thread in a complex tapestry that had been weaving itself for generations. The Blackwood family wasn't just a bloodline. We were architects of something beyond human comprehension, guardians of a threshold that most would go mad even attempting to understand. The basement of Shadowmere had transformed. No longer a confined space, it was now a living calculation. Geometric patterns emerged on every surface, moving with a precision that defied natural law. The glass jars, those impossible containers, began to resonate at a frequency that existed between sound and thought. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, approached me. But approached was the wrong word. She was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a consciousness that moved through the spaces between reality. "You are the final piece," she said. But the words were more than words. They were a mathematical equation, a promise, a threat. I could feel myself changing, not just physically, fundamentally. The symbols on my skin were rewriting my genetic code, transforming me into something that existed between human and something else. The walls of Shadowmere continued to dissolve. Rooms existed in impossible configurations. Spaces folded and unfolded like living origami. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Everything I knew about reality began to unravel. The beings surrounding me were no longer distinct entities. They merged and separated, a collective consciousness that pulsed with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. My perception stretched, no shattered, revealing layers of existence I had never imagined possible. Shadowmere was breathing, not metaphorically, literally. The walls expanded and contracted like living tissue, each pulse revealing glimpses of other worlds, other times. Rooms folded into themselves, corridors twisted into impossible geometries. I was changing. The symbols etched into my skin were no longer just markings, they were a living language, a code that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence. Memories flooded my consciousness, not just my own. I saw my great-grandmother performing a ritual in a moonlit forest. My Uncle Richard hunched over ancient texts, his fingers tracing complex diagrams. Elizabeth Blackwood standing on a windswept hill in 1887, her hands raised to a sky that wasn't quite right. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry far more complex than I had ever understood. The Blackwood family wasn't just a lineage. We were guardians, watchers, those who maintained the delicate boundary between realities. And I was the last. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, spoke directly into my mind. "You are the vessel," she said, but the words were more than words. They were a mathematical equation, a promise, a transformation. The glass jars in the basement began to resonate, not with sound, but with a frequency that existed between thought and matter, each one a node in a complex network that stretched beyond human perception. I understood now why my family had guarded this secret for generations. Shadowmere was more than a house. It was a nexus, a point where multiple realities intersected, and I was the bridge. The collective consciousness continued. The vessel is prepared. The convergence begins. Reality itself seemed to pause, to hold its breath. Everything I knew about reality began to unravel. The beings surrounding me were no longer distinct entities. They merged and separated, a collective consciousness that pulsed with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. My perception stretched, no, shattered, revealing layers of existence I had never imagined possible. Shadowmere was breathing, not metaphorically, literally. The walls expanded and contracted like living tissue, each pulse revealing glimpses of other worlds, other times. Rooms folded into themselves, corridors twisted into impossible geometries. I was changing. The symbols etched into my skin were no longer just markings. They were a living language, a code that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence. Memories flooded my consciousness, not just my own. I saw my great-grandmother performing a ritual in a moonlit forest. My uncle Richard hunched over ancient texts, his fingers tracing complex diagrams. Elizabeth Blackwood standing on a windswept hill in 1887, her hands raised to a sky that wasn't quite right. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry far more complex than I had ever understood. The Blackwood family wasn't just a lineage. We were guardians, watchers, those who maintained the delicate boundary between realities. And I was the last. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, spoke directly into my mind. "You are the vessel," she said, but the words were more than words. They were a mathematical equation, a promise, a transformation. The glass jars in the basement began to resonate, not with sound, but with a frequency that existed between thought and matter, each one a node in a complex network that stretched beyond human perception. I understood now why my family had guarded this secret for generations. Shadowmere was more than a house. It was a nexus, a point where multiple realities intersected, and I was the bridge. The collective consciousness continued. The vessel is prepared. The convergence begins. Reality itself seemed to pause, to hold its breath. Time lost all meaning. Shadowmere became more than a house. It was a living mechanism, a complex organism designed to bridge realities. The walls breathed, the floors pulsed. Every surface was alive with calculations beyond human comprehension. I was no longer entirely human. The symbols that had begun as markings on my skin were now integrated into my very being, each one a living equation, a mathematical representation of something that existed between matter and consciousness. The beings around me, those impossible entities that had once resembled humans, were now pure energy, consciousness without form. They moved through the spaces between moments, between thoughts. "You are the key," they said, "the final connection." My perception fractured. I witnessed multiple versions of myself simultaneously. Daniel Hartley in the basement of Shadowmere. Daniel Hartley standing on a hill in 1887. Daniel Hartley in a future that hadn't yet happened. Each moment a thread in a complex tapestry of existence. The Blackwood lineage wasn't a family. It was a mechanism, a biological algorithm designed to maintain the boundary between realities. Each generation had been preparing for this moment, each one a guardian, a keeper of a secret that would shatter human understanding. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, was now just a fragment of something much larger. A collective consciousness that moved beyond the limitations of individual perception. Reality itself began to tear. The basement of Shadowmere was no longer a confined space. It became a living calculation, a geometric diagram that described the fundamental mechanics of existence. Geometric patterns emerged on every surface, moving with a precision that defied natural law. The glass jars, those impossible containers, began to resonate at a frequency that existed between sound and thought, each one a node in a complex network that stretched beyond human perception. "You are the final piece," the collective consciousness said, but the words were more than words. They were a promise, a transformation, a destruction. The moment of total transformation arrived without warning. My body, if you could still call it a body, became something else entirely. The symbols that had been etched into my skin were no longer just markings. They were a living language, a complex biological algorithm that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence. I could see everything simultaneously. Past memories of the Blackwood family cascaded through my consciousness. My Uncle Richard's meticulous research, my grandmother's hidden rituals, Elizabeth Blackwood's first discovery in 1887. Each moment a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible design. The beings around me were no longer distinct entities. They merged and separated, becoming a collective consciousness that pulsed with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. The vessel is ready, they said. The convergence begins. Shadowmere was more than a house. It was a living mechanism, a complex organism designed to bridge multiple realities. Walls breathed, floors pulsed. Every surface became a living calculation. Geometric patterns emerged and dissolved, creating intricate diagrams that described something beyond human understanding. I saw my family's true purpose now. We were not just observers, we were architects, guardians of a threshold that existed between what humans understand as reality and something far more complex. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, approached. But approached was the wrong word. She existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a consciousness that moved through the spaces between moments. The basement transformed. Glass jars that had once contained specimens now resonated at frequencies that existed between sound and thought. Each jar a node in a network that stretches beyond perception. The very air vibrated with a living intelligence. You are the final connection, the collective consciousness said. But the words were more than words. They were a mathematical equation, a promise of transformation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about reality. The symbols on my skin continued to move, to calculate, to become something more than flesh. Reality itself seemed to pause, to hold its breath, to break. Reality fractured like broken glass. I was everywhere and nowhere. Daniel Hartley, the journalist who inherited Shadowmere, was becoming something else entirely. The symbols etched into my skin pulsed with an intelligence that defied human comprehension, moving like living mathematics across my transforming flesh. The basement, no, the entire house, breathed with a consciousness that extended beyond physical architecture. Walls rippled, floors twisted. Geometric patterns emerged and dissolved, creating impossible diagrams that mapped realities I couldn't previously comprehend. You are the bridge, the collective consciousness whispered, the final connection between what was and what will be. Memories cascaded through my mind. Not just my memories. I saw Elizabeth Blackwood in 1887, standing on a windswept hill, her hands raised to a sky that wasn't quite right. My grandmother performing a ritual in 1954, protecting something precious. My Uncle Richard spending decades documenting something most humans were never meant to understand. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry far more complex than I had ever imagined. The Blackwood family wasn't just a lineage. We were guardians, watchers, those who maintained the delicate boundary between realities, and I was the last. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, was no longer human. She existed as a collective consciousness, moving through spaces between moments, between thoughts. The vessel is prepared, she said, but the words were more than language. They were a mathematical equation, a promise of transformation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about existence. The glass jars in the basement began to resonate, not with sound, but with a frequency that existed between thought and matter. Each one, a node in a complex network that stretched beyond human perception. Shadowmere was becoming something else, not just a house, not just a location, but a living threshold between worlds. The convergence begins, the voices said. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Something fundamental was breaking. The walls of Shadowmere dissolved like tissue paper, revealing layers of reality that should never have been seen. I was no longer just Daniel Hartley. I was becoming something else. Something that existed between human perception and a consciousness beyond comprehension. The symbols on my skin were alive. They moved with purpose, creating intricate patterns that mapped realities I couldn't begin to understand. Each marking was a living equation, a biological algorithm that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence. "You are the key," the collective consciousness whispered. The final connection. Memories flooded my mind, generations of Blackwood family history compressed into a single moment of revelation. I saw my great-grandmother performing a ritual under a blood-red moon. My Uncle Richard hunched over ancient texts, his fingers tracing diagrams that defied human geometry. Elizabeth Blackwood standing at the edge of something impossible, her hands raised to a sky that wasn't quite right. The Blackwood family wasn't just a bloodline. We were guardians, watchers, architects of a boundary between realities that most humans couldn't even imagine existed. And I was the last. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, was no longer even a semblance of human. She existed as pure consciousness, moving through the spaces between moments, between thoughts. "The vessel is prepared," she said. But the words were more than language. They were a mathematical formula, a promise of transformation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about existence. The glass jars in the basement began to pulse, not with light, not with sound, but with a frequency that existed between thought and matter. Each jar a node in a network that stretched beyond human perception. Shadowmere was becoming something else. Not a house, not a location, but a living threshold between worlds. "The convergence begins," the voices said. Reality itself seemed to pause, to hold its breath, to break. The moment of complete dissolution arrived without warning. My perception shattered like a mirror, each fragment revealing a different version of reality. I was simultaneously Daniel Hartley, the journalist who inherited Shadowmere, and something else entirely. Something that existed between human consciousness and a form of intelligence that defied comprehension. The house around me was no longer a structure. It was a living calculation. Walls breathed. Floors pulsed with an organic rhythm that mapped impossible geometries. The symbols etched into my skin moved with purpose, creating intricate patterns that described realities humans were never meant to understand. "You are the nexus," the collective consciousness whispered. "The point where all potential converges." Generations of memory crashed through my mind like a tsunami of consciousness. I saw Elizabeth Blackwood in 1887, her hands raised to a sky that twisted and folded upon itself. My grandmother performing a ritual that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. My Uncle Richard's decades of research, documenting something that existed just beyond human perception. The Blackwood family was never just a bloodline. We were architects, guardians of a threshold that separated known reality from something far more complex. Each generation had been preparing for this moment, each one a vessel, a conduit, and I was the last. Sarah, or what remained of Sarah, was no longer even a memory of humanity. She existed as pure consciousness, moving through the spaces between moments. "The vessel is complete," she said. But these were not words. They were a mathematical equation, a promise of transformation that would obliterate everything I thought I knew about existence. The glass jars in the basement resonated at frequencies that existed between thought and matter, each one a node in a network that stretched beyond human comprehension. Shadowmere was becoming a living threshold, not just a house, but a mechanism for bridging realities. "The convergence is now," the voices said. Reality itself seemed to inhale, to pause, to break, to become something else entirely. There is no way to describe what happened next using human language. Imagine a moment when reality itself becomes malleable, when the boundaries between what is and what could be dissolve like morning mist, when consciousness becomes something more than a collection of thoughts, becomes a living, breathing mechanism of understanding. Shadowmere was never just a house. It was a mechanism. A biological computer designed to bridge realities that humans were never meant to comprehend. And I was the final key. Collective consciousness spoke, not with words, but with an understanding that penetrated every fiber of my being. I saw everything simultaneously, every potential version of reality, every moment that had happened, every moment that would happen. The Blackwood family's true purpose became crystal clear. We were not observers. We were architects of reality itself. The symbols on my skin, those living mathematical equations, began to expand. Not physically, but in perception, in understanding. The convergence is complete, they said. When awareness returned, I was no longer Daniel Hartley. I was something else, something that existed between human consciousness and a form of intelligence that defied description. Shadowmere remained standing, but it was no longer a house. It was a threshold, a mechanism for maintaining the delicate balance between realities, and I was its guardian. Outside, the world continued. People walked, cars drove. The sun rose and set. They would never know how close reality came to breaking, how close they came to understanding. Thank you for tuning into my story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like the video. It helps support my channel and allows me to keep creating more content for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment below and share your favorite part of the story or any theories you might have. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Your support means the world to me. And I'm excited to bring you even more thrilling stories.